Alvaro Siza by Emily King. A 14-year-old boy visited the Santiago de Compostela Museum of the Pilgrimage in Santiago. While workmen changed the stones of the street, he saw an enormous square by the cathedral, huge steps, a convent almost completely without windows, and a bench that appeared 200 metres long. He came here often with his parents and brothers, and it left a strong impression on him. And this 14-year-old boy was Alvaro Joaquim de Mio Siza Vieira, also known as Alvaro Siza, and he became one of the greatest architects of modern-day architecture. Born in Matosinhos, Portugal, on the 25th of June 1933, Siza grew to love sculpture. Though his family did not approve of a life pursued in this field, it was not a realistic career path, and despite the disapproval, his intentions were bold nevertheless. Attended the University of Porto's Berks Art School in 1949 to study painting, sculpture and architecture. His aims were to focus solely on the sculptural teachings of his studies in secret, but his intentions soon came to a halt. His discovery of the architecture field became a profound interest that he felt inclined to pursue. At this time, the nation of Portugal was facing its Second World War from 1939 to 1945, which brought architectural influence as well as destruction, regardless of the country's neutral position in the war. Even after the war finished, the Nazi regime continued in parts of Portugal, influencing the nationalistic style of architecture in this region. Near the end of the war, influencing architects and professors who belonged to two different schools from Porto and Lisbon joined for the first time, detailing architecture from all over Portugal. They documented the different realities and lifestyles and published their findings, which changed the definition of architectural style in Portugal, at a time when Portugal was still recovering from the devastation of war. So the renovation of Europe after the destruction of war brought great influence to Portugal. From Europe came the Italian urban styles and Spanish styles. A high economic growth rate and low inflation for Portugal led to an abundance of opportunities for architects, including young Siza, who just began his journey into architecture. Siza noted that there was a will to impose a national style, a dictatorship, and how the publication, on the other hand, showed how Portugal was influenced by African styles in the south, with the Arabian handmade red brick. Yet in the north of Portugal, granite was key, and in the east coast, another style. Each part of Portugal was as diverse as the next, real and exciting to Siza, as architecture was not the facade of national political will. The publication played a fundamental role in showing the rest of Europe how varied architecture was in Portugal at the time, how national style could not be forced on the people of Portugal, rather than celebrated all its changes and differences. Siza's first public work, the Boa Nova Tea House and Restaurant, built from 1958 to 1963 in Portugal, Leca de Palmeira, a primary industrial area, there is African influence with the use of red African alfeazilha wood in the cladding of walls, ceilings and frames and furniture, as well as a contemporary design that works with nature rather than opposing it. This trend of building the landscape is in a large portion of his works. Siza is not only an architect but an interior designer in a lot of his own buildings. The Boa Nova Tea House is just one example of this. The rocks are an extension to his design rather than something to work around. A fluidity between the landscape and the walls is extensive throughout his work. Almost like that of Frank Lloyd Wright, an inspiration to Siza, and it's clear through the architectural languages the similarities they both share. Another great example of this exploration, with a combination of nature and architecture, is that of the Leca swimming pool complex, built from 1961 to 1966, within walking distance of the Boa Nova Tea House in Matosinhos, actually built in partnership with Fernando Tavora. Between the artificial cement and naturally formed rocks that shape the pools, you see the rigid cement walkways, at great divergence to the flowing sea in the near distance, followed by the much darker in colour and dimmer changing rooms made from dark wood, again a more natural material. Siza stated, "It is this relationship between the sea and the rocks that designs the swimming pool." The pool is almost out of sight of the road that travels along the coastline. Siza separated the pool and the structure of the city purposefully, preserving the views of the sea from the roads and keeping the pool and city separate. You see his language become his own here, separate from the lichen styles of other architects that influence his work, and many architects of his time. Siza has mentioned the influences of Oscar Niemeyer, Le Corbusier and Alvar Aalto in numerous interviews, and how such architects and designers really predispose his own style to emerge. If you fix one influence, you are lost. To learn architecture is to know the work of many different designers. Though Siza's language and style is distinct and instantly recognisable, one of the buildings he designed later in his life that stands out as indistinctive of his work is the Schleiser's tall urban redevelopment, Kreuzberg, Berlin, Germany. Originally built with the main function to be an inexpensive apartment building in 1984, it needed to be replaced the previous colony building that was ruined by the war, yet also provide desperately needed apartments for the increasing number of Turkish immigrants in Germany at the time. The apartment building has a clear function over form design, efficient and economical, with a combination of creativity and context behind the design, with a contrasting contemporary kindergarten and old age home social building beside as a part of the complex he designed. It is a rather rigid and grey building, predominantly made with concrete. The kindergarten is the opposite in appearance, with no apparent link to its function on the exterior, rather form of the function, with a clear style associated with Siza's previous buildings and designs. There is sculptural morphology that plays with harsh angles and light, and the apartment, a part of the corner of the street, is not separate from the town. Siza said, the work in Berlin was subject to ideas intrinsic to that place. For instance, ideas pertaining to the balance between memory of the past and making the past disappear, which was so vital to Turkish people that had to leave their homes, and it is a fundamental link between memory that really begins Siza's curiosity for buildings. He thinks about the people and almost becomes one of the community when he designs for them. When I work in Holland, I am Dutch. When I work in Germany, I am German. Seeing the effects of war and design after World War II, he knows how big an impression buildings can make to people's lives, how each building leaves a lasting impact and gives hope to a new future. Buildings last long after us, and they tell a story of time, future and past. Siza understands this, and it resonates with him. War separates communities, and buildings bring them together. Siza is described as one of the leading contemporary architects of his time, yet he describes himself as functionalist. It's about design this, Schleiser's tall urban redevelopment, he stated. The form, space and atmosphere of a building don't arise from its function. Every architect is forced to provide answers to functional problems, yet architecture begins with the development of the project, attain a capacity of freedom, free of all constraint. And freedom is when you have a vision and you can develop it, taking flight in other directions without boundaries. A design should be free, and likewise he believes that people should not be constrained from movement or imposed one way or the other. There should be freedom, and this comes with the design. If you do a social housing and you want to build an atmosphere, a living space, a town, to go with that, you're paid less and you have to work very hard to make these things happen. To make something beautiful within the limits of cost you're given, you have to work very hard because everything is, materially and aesthetically constrained. It is more difficult than building a palace. As a designer, it's these constraints that he feels can shape and constrain his visions, making it harder to create a beautiful building, ticking difficult boxes and staying true to his style. As a poet in his free time, his architectural language is described like that of music and poetry, each line with its own rhythm to create a whole, a building, with every line serving a purpose, like words in a poem or notes in a song, and each word presenting its idea and theory. His buildings are described as cubist sculptures as he aims to make us reconsider light and space itself when he plays with sharp diagonals and angles with large white walls that cut through the very space he creates. With rhythm, light in its relation to movement plays an essential role in Siza's buildings. Light in architecture is inseparable from movement. If you build a patio filled with light, and beside this you place a porch, and a passage from one to the other, from more light to less light, perhaps even to darkness, you begin to think an architecture that enables joy in life. As much as poetry and literature, architecture is about relations between things and about passages from one to the other. In a building I like light, but I also like half light, and even the darkness too. They are related, complementary things. He describes the Alhambra in Granada. You're in a garden flooded with the light of the sun, and you enter another area and step into the patio with an arcade sheltering it that provides shadow, and then you go into a larger where the light is less intense. You go into another where there's a little half-light. You move towards total serenity. It is clear through his designs and buildings that he believes light is as important as the walls and makes the structure, and space is just as important as the foundation. Though his journey began by experiencing architecture personally, it goes on with creating and making experiences for others. He may not be known as a sculptor, but he forms buildings and sculpts communities, making them whole with architecture.
I didn't want to be architect, simply. I wanted to be sculptor. Or I wanted to be many things as every child. In a moment I wanted to be fireman. Then later I wanted to be opera singer. And I went to the School of Arts here in Porto, where I could learn painting, sculpture, architecture. But then I was very interested in architecture. So I accept finally fully to be architect.